She treated her husband badly every single day for over 40 years. He swept the floors, made her coffee, and endured her constant criticism in silence. Until one morning, he packed his bags and vanished without saying a single word. When she searched through his belongings, she found something that broke her heart completely. Hidden letters he had written but never sent, revealing decades of pain she never knew she had caused. A story of awakening, forgiveness, and second chances. Get ready, because this story will touch your heart in ways you never expected. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like on this video, and comment where you're watching from. Nobody in the neighborhood could have imagined that the quiet couple in the old Victorian house on Maple Street harbored so much noise behind those weathered blue shutters and creaking front porch. Their daily routine seemed harmless to outside eyes. Harold sweeping the walkway each dawn, Dorothy watering her prized rose bushes with the same careful precision she used to avoid any tender gesture toward her husband of 43 years. But inside those walls, painted the color of faded cream, their home was built from hard silences, cutting words and glances that always seemed to look anywhere but at each other. Dorothy was firm, critical, demanding about everything. From the way Harold folded the Sunday paper to how he stirred his morning coffee, nothing ever seemed quite right in her eyes. She had opinions about the angle of his reading glasses, the speed of his walk to the mailbox, even the way he breathed too loudly during their evening news ritual. Harold, for his part, remained patient, methodical, devoted to the small details that only time teaches you to notice. He knew to hang his jacket exactly 3 inches from the closet's left edge, to set his coffee mug on the counter with the handle facing east, and to fold the cloth napkins into perfect triangles the way Dorothy had liked them in the beginning, decades ago when such things still mattered to her heart instead of just her sense of order. But time, oh how time had worn away more than just the marriage. It had swallowed their tenderness whole, drowned their smiles in a sea of routine indifference, and left their touch as cold as winter morning air in their small Connecticut town. The house itself seemed to hold its breath around them, as if even the walls understood that love had been replaced by mere coexistence, and joy had been traded for the simple act of making it through another day without a major argument. On the morning Harold simply vanished, taking nothing but 2 worn suitcases and leaving behind not even a single note of explanation, Dorothy's carefully constructed world cracked right down the middle like an egg dropped on kitchen tile. She had discovered his absence the way she discovered most things about Harold these days, by accident. She had gone to the bedroom to complain about the way he had left his coffee cup on the counter instead of placing it directly in the dishwasher, only to find his side of the closet completely empty except for the wire hangers swaying slightly in the morning breeze from their open bedroom window. The sound of the front gate banging in the wind seemed louder now, more insistent, like it was trying to tell her something important that she kept missing. The silence inside the house felt different too. Not the familiar quiet of 2 people avoiding conversation, but something much more final and frightening. It was a silence that screamed of emptiness, of doors that would never open again, of morning coffee made for only one person. For the first time in decades, Dorothy felt something that wasn't anger or impatience, or her usual critical dissatisfaction with everything around her. She felt fear. Pure, cold fear that settled in her chest like a stone. Fear of being truly alone. Fear of having lost someone who, despite their lack of recent affection, had been the only constant in her carefully ordered life. That fear drove her to do something she hadn't done in years. She began to search. Really search. Not just looking for Harold, but looking for clues about who he had become during all those years when she had been too busy correcting him to actually see him. She went through his dresser drawers with trembling fingers, touching his undershirts and socks as if they might tell her where he had gone. She checked his desk in the small den where he paid their bills, and read his books about American history, running her hands over the smooth wooden surface that still smelled faintly of the lemon oil he used to polish it every Saturday morning. It was while searching through the linen closet, looking behind the holiday tablecloths they hadn't used in years, that Dorothy found something that stopped her cold. A manila folder, thick with papers, hidden behind a stack of towels that smelled of lavender sachets. Her hands shook as she opened it, expecting perhaps insurance papers or tax documents. Instead, she found dozens of letters. Not love letters, but something much more painful. Letters Harold had written but never sent. Letters addressed to no one and everyone. Letters that spanned 20 years of their marriage, each one dated and written in his careful, slanted handwriting. The first letter was dated March 15th, 15 years ago. Dorothy remembered that date because it was the day after her 60th birthday. When she had criticized Harold for choosing the wrong flowers for her small celebration. She had wanted white roses. He had brought yellow ones. And she had spent the entire evening making sure he understood his mistake. In the letter, Harold had written about that day. About how he had visited 3 different flower shops to find the perfect blooms. How he had chosen yellow because he remembered her wearing a yellow dress on their wedding day. And how beautiful she had looked. He wrote about the confusion in his eyes when she had turned away from his gift. And how he had sat in his car in their driveway for 20 minutes afterward, trying to understand what he had done wrong. Dorothy read letter after letter, each one more heartbreaking than the last. Harold wrote about the loneliness of sharing a bed with someone who flinched when he accidentally touched her during sleep. He wrote about the small humiliations of being corrected in front of neighbors when he told a story she thought he was telling wrong. He wrote about his attempts to bring her small gifts, a magazine he thought she might enjoy, a piece of pie from the bakery downtown, a book about gardening, and how each offering was met with criticism about the waste of money or questions about why he thought she would want such a thing. One letter, written just 2 years ago, broke something inside Dorothy's chest. Harold had written about a dream he'd had where they were young again, dancing in their kitchen the way they had during their first year of marriage when everything was possible, and every day brought some small joy. In the dream, Dorothy had smiled at him the way she used to, before responsibility and disappointment had hardened her heart into something she barely recognized. He wrote about waking up from that dream and looking at her sleeping face, remembering how much he had once loved making her laugh, and how he couldn't remember the last time he had succeeded in bringing her even the smallest amount of happiness. The last letter in the folder was dated just 1 week before he left. It was shorter than the others, and the handwriting looked tired, as if the effort of writing had exhausted him. In it, Harold had written about acceptance, about understanding that some kinds of love aren't meant to be healed, some distances can't be bridged, and some people are better off apart than together. He wrote about a place he remembered from their early marriage, a cabin by a lake where they had spent their honeymoon and the first few summers afterward, when they still believed they could build something beautiful together. He wrote about wanting to see if that place still existed, and if being there might help him remember who he used to be before the weight of their broken marriage had made him feel invisible in his own life. Dorothy sat on the bathroom floor with these letters scattered around her like fallen leaves, crying harder than she had cried since her mother's funeral 20 years ago. But these weren't just tears of sadness or regret. They were tears of recognition. For the first time, she was seeing herself through Harold's eyes, and the reflection was almost too painful to bear. When had she become this person? When had her love transformed into control, her care into criticism, her protection into cruelty? The answers didn't come all at once, but they began to form like storm clouds gathering on a distant horizon. She thought about her mother, dead now for 2 decades, who had ruled their household with the same iron grip Dorothy had learned to use on Harold. Her mother had believed that keeping a man meant keeping him in line, that love was something you showed through improvement rather than acceptance. Dorothy remembered her father's quiet compliance, his small acts of rebellion like reading his newspaper in the garage instead of the living room, his careful ways of agreeing with her mother while still maintaining some small piece of himself. She had sworn she would never become her mother, yet here she was, sitting on her bathroom floor, holding evidence that she had become something even worse. There were other memories too, painful ones she had pushed deep down where they couldn't hurt her anymore. The miscarriages early in their marriage, 3 of them, each one taking a little piece of her softness and replacing it with protective armor. The financial struggles during Harold's unemployment in their 30s, when fear had made her controlling and criticism had felt safer than vulnerability. The slow realization that the dreams they had shared as newlyweds might never come true, and how disappointment had made her bitter toward the man who represented those failed dreams. But understanding the reasons behind her behavior didn't make the consequences any less real. Harold was gone, and she had driven him away with the death of 1,000 small cuts. Every corrected sentence, every heavy sigh, every moment when she had chosen being right over being kind had led to this moment. She was alone in a house that suddenly felt enormous and empty, surrounded by the evidence of a love she had slowly, methodically destroyed. The neighbors began to notice Harold's absence after about a week. Mrs. Peterson from next door asked if Harold was feeling well since she hadn't seen him tending to his vegetable garden. The mailman mentioned that the mail was piling up in ways it never had before, since Harold had always been so punctual about collecting it each afternoon at 3 o'clock. Dorothy found herself making excuses, saying Harold was visiting his cousin in Vermont or helping his brother with some repairs. or taking a short vacation alone to visit historical sites he'd always wanted to see. The lies came easily because admitting the truth felt impossible. How could she tell these people that her husband had left her? How could she explain that a man who had seemed so content with his quiet life had been so miserable that disappearing felt like his only option? But the lies became harder to maintain as days turned into weeks. Dorothy found herself avoiding the neighbors, hurrying from her car to her front door without making eye contact, letting the phone ring unanswered when she recognized familiar voices on the caller ID. The isolation felt like punishment, but she wasn't sure if she was punishing herself, or if this was simply the natural consequence of a life built on emotional distance. Either way, the loneliness was becoming unbearable. 3 weeks after Harold's departure, Dorothy made a decision that surprised even her. She was going to find him, not to drag him home, or to demand explanations, or to prove that she was right about something. She was going to find him because she needed to understand what she had lost, and because some small part of her heart still remembered what it felt like to love Harold Winters in the beginning, when everything between them had been gentle and full of possibility. But finding someone who doesn't want to be found proved more difficult than Dorothy had imagined. Harold had always been methodical about everything, and apparently his disappearance was no exception. She started by calling his brother Robert in Minnesota, trying to sound casual when she asked if Harold had mentioned any travel plans. Robert's voice had been cool and careful when he told her that Harold hadn't contacted him in months, and she could hear the unasked questions in his tone. She called Harold's former colleagues from the insurance company where he had worked for 30 years before retirement, but none of them had heard from him either. Dorothy even did something that would have been unthinkable just a month earlier. She drove to Harold's barbershop downtown and asked Mr. Morrison if Harold had mentioned any plans during his last haircut. Mr. Morrison, who had been cutting Harold's hair for 15 years, looked at her with such surprise that Dorothy realized this might have been the first time she had ever shown any interest in Harold's conversations with other people. The look in the old barber's eyes made her understand how completely she had separated herself from Harold's world, how little she knew about the person he was when he wasn't walking on eggshells around her critical gaze. The lack of information was frustrating, but it was also illuminating. Dorothy began to understand that Harold had lived much of his life outside of her awareness, maintaining relationships and interests that she had never bothered to learn about. She found business cards in his desk drawer for places she had never heard him mention: a book club that met at the library every Thursday, a volunteer group that helped maintain the hiking trails in the state park, a men's group at the Methodist church that discussed books about faith and philosophy. Harold had built an entire existence beyond their marriage, and Dorothy had been so focused on what was wrong with him that she had never noticed what was right about the life he had created for himself. This realization brought a new kind of pain, but also something that might have been hope. If Harold had other places where he felt valued and appreciated, maybe her opinion of him wasn't the only one that mattered. Maybe the man she had seen as inadequate and frustrating had qualities that other people cherished. Maybe the problem wasn't with Harold at all, but with the lens through which she had been viewing him for all these years. Dorothy decided to visit some of these places Harold had frequented, not to interrogate people about his whereabouts, but to try to understand who he had been when he wasn't being criticized or corrected. She started with the library, where the Thursday book club was meeting in a small conference room near the reference section. She sat in a chair near the periodicals, pretending to read a magazine while listening to their discussion about a biography of Theodore Roosevelt. When someone mentioned that Harold had always provided the most thoughtful insights about historical context, Dorothy felt something shift inside her chest. These people respected Harold's intelligence, valued his contributions, looked forward to his participation. The Harold they described was confident, knowledgeable, funny in a quiet way that made others lean in to listen better. At the church men's group, Dorothy learned even more surprising things about her husband. She didn't attend the meeting directly, but she spoke with Pastor Williams afterward, explaining that she was trying to understand more about Harold's interests since they had grown apart over the years. Pastor Williams spoke about Harold's deep faith, his thoughtful questions about forgiveness and redemption, his quiet way of offering support to other men who were struggling with difficult marriages or family problems. The pastor mentioned that Harold had often spoken about the challenge of loving someone who seemed to have stopped loving you back, and how faith could sustain you through seasons when human relationships felt impossible. Dorothy left that conversation feeling as if she had been introduced to a stranger who happened to have her husband's name. The Harold that Pastor Williams described was wise, compassionate, spiritually mature. He was someone who helped others and inspired respect. He was someone worth knowing, worth loving, worth keeping. and she had driven him away because she had been too blind to see any of these qualities through her fog of criticism and disappointment. But knowing she had made a terrible mistake and knowing how to fix it were two very different things. Dorothy had spent so many years being critical and controlling that she wasn't sure she knew how to be any other way. The patterns of their marriage had been carved deep, like water cutting grooves in stone over decades of repetition. Could she really change something so fundamental about herself? And even if she could, would it matter if Harold was gone forever? The answer to that question came from an unexpected source. Dorothy's cousin Linda, whom she hadn't spoken to in nearly 5 years because of some long-forgotten disagreement about holiday plans, called one Tuesday evening in late May. Linda's voice was hesitant when Dorothy answered the phone, as if she wasn't sure whether she would be welcome. But she had news that she thought Dorothy should know. Harold had been to visit her and her husband Jim at their farm in western Massachusetts. He had stayed for 3 days, helping Jim with some repairs to their barn, and spending long hours sitting on their front porch, talking about things that Linda said seemed too personal for her to share without Harold's permission. Linda's voice grew warmer as she told Dorothy about Harold's visit. She said he had seemed lighter somehow, less burdened, as if being away from home had allowed him to remember parts of himself that had been buried for a long time. He had helped her plant a new flower garden, sharing stories about the roses he and Dorothy had grown in their early years of marriage, before she had stopped trusting him to do anything without correction. He had cooked dinner for them one night, preparing a beef stew that Linda said was the best she had ever tasted, seasoned with herbs he had grown himself in a small garden behind their garage that Dorothy had never paid attention to. But the most important thing Linda told her was about a conversation Harold had had with Jim while they were working on the barn. Harold had mentioned a place from his past, a lake house where he and Dorothy had spent their honeymoon and several early anniversaries. He said he was thinking of visiting there, to see if it still existed and to try to remember what it had felt like to be happy. Linda had asked if he was planning to go alone, and Harold had said that he hoped not, but that some bridges might be too broken to rebuild. He had asked Jim what he thought about second chances, and whether people could really change after decades of being set in their ways. Dorothy's hands were shaking when she hung up the phone. She knew exactly which lake house Harold was talking about. It was a small cabin on Lake Champlain in Vermont, owned by Harold's uncle who had let them use it for a week each summer during their first 5 years of marriage. Those had been some of the happiest times of their life together, when they were still discovering each other and believing that their love could overcome any obstacle. She remembered Harold teaching her to fish from the small dock, both of them laughing when she squealed every time she caught something. She remembered making breakfast together in the tiny kitchen, taking long walks on the wooded trails, falling asleep in each other's arms while listening to the gentle sound of water lapping against the shore. But she also remembered why they had stopped going there. It was during their 6th year of marriage, when Dorothy's first miscarriage had left her feeling fragile and angry at the world. Harold had suggested they skip their annual trip that year, thinking she might need time to heal at home. Dorothy had interpreted his concern as rejection, as evidence that he blamed her for their loss. She had told him that if he didn't want to go to the lake with her anymore, they simply wouldn't go. Harold had tried to explain that he thought she might prefer to be near her doctor and her support system, but Dorothy had already made up her mind. They never went back to the lake house, and Harold never suggested it again. Now, more than 35 years later, Harold was returning to that place alone, or at least, he was hoping to return there. Dorothy realized that this might be her only chance to find him, but more importantly, it might be her only chance to show him that she could be different, that the woman he had fallen in love with at that lake still existed somewhere underneath all the years of disappointment and control. For the first time since Harold had left, Dorothy felt something that might have been hope. She was going to go to Lake Champlain. She was going to find her husband, and she was going to try to prove to both of them that some bridges, no matter how broken they might seem, could still be repaired with enough patience and love. But first, she had to figure out how to become the kind of person worth coming home to. And that, Dorothy was beginning to understand, was going to be the hardest work of her life. Dorothy spent the next 3 days preparing for a journey she hadn't taken in over 3 decades. But this wasn't just about packing clothes or planning a route to Vermont. This was about preparing herself to face the woman she had become, and somehow finding a way back to the woman she used to be. She stood in front of her bedroom mirror, really looking at herself for the first time in years. The face that stared back was harder than she remembered, etched with lines that came not from laughter, but from years of frowning and pursing her lips in disapproval. Her gray hair was pulled back in the same severe style she had worn for 20 years. Practical, but not particularly flattering. Even her posture spoke of someone who was perpetually braced for disappointment. She began to make small changes, tentative steps toward becoming someone Harold might recognize from their early years together. She let her hair down from its tight bun, surprised to see that it fell in soft waves around her shoulders. She chose clothes that weren't just practical, but actually pretty. A blue sweater the color of spring sky that Harold had bought her 2 Christmases ago, and that she had dismissed as too frivolous for everyday wear. She found herself moving differently, less like a woman marching through life's obligations, and more like someone who might actually enjoy the journey. But the real work wasn't happening in front of the mirror. It was happening in the quiet moments when Dorothy forced herself to remember not just the good times with Harold, but the moments when she had chosen criticism over kindness, control over compassion. She remembered the time Harold had surprised her with breakfast in bed for their 20th anniversary, and how she had spent the entire meal pointing out that he had used too much salt in the eggs, and that crumbs were getting on the sheets. She remembered the evening he had tried to dance with her in their kitchen, while the radio played an old song from their courtship, and how she had pushed him away because she was worried about scuff marks on the linoleum floor. Each memory was like pressing on a bruise, painful but necessary. Dorothy was beginning to understand that her behavior hadn't come from not loving Harold, but from loving him in the wrong way. She had tried to love him by improving him, fixing him, making him into her idea of what a perfect husband should be. But in doing so, she had forgotten to love him for who he actually was. She had spent so much energy trying to change Harold that she had never stopped to appreciate the man he already was. The drive to Vermont took her through countryside that looked like something from a painting. Rolling hills covered in late spring green and small towns that seemed untouched by time. Dorothy found herself driving slower than usual, not because she was nervous about seeing Harold, but because she was noticing things she hadn't paid attention to in years. The way morning light filtered through maple trees, the sound of church bells echoing across valleys, the sight of couples walking hand in hand down main streets in towns where life moved at a gentler pace than the suburban neighborhood she and Harold had called home for so long. She stopped for lunch at a small diner in a town called Millfield, the kind of place where the waitress knew everyone's name, and the coffee came with unlimited refills and genuine warmth. Dorothy sat in a booth near the window, watching people move through their daily routines with an ease she envied. She saw an elderly man helping his wife into their car, his hand gentle and protective on her elbow. She watched a middle-aged couple sharing a piece of pie, laughing about something that made them both light up like teenagers. These people seemed to know something about love that Dorothy had forgotten. Something about choosing joy over being right, connection over control. The waitress, a woman about Dorothy's age with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, noticed Dorothy's thoughtful silence. She refilled Dorothy's coffee cup and asked if she was passing through or visiting family in the area. Something about the woman's genuine interest made Dorothy find herself telling the truth, or at least part of it. She explained that she was trying to find her husband, that they had been separated, and she was hoping to reconnect with him at a place that had been special to them in the past. The waitress, whose name tag read Mary Ellen, sat down across from Dorothy for a moment during the lunch lull. She spoke about her own marriage, 45 years to a man who drove her crazy half the time, but who she couldn't imagine living without. She talked about the importance of saying you're sorry, even when you think you're right, especially when you think you're right. She mentioned that the hardest lesson she had learned about marriage was that being married to someone didn't give you the right to try to change them, only the privilege of loving them as they were. Mary Ellen's words stayed with Dorothy as she continued her drive north toward Lake Champlain. She began to understand that her journey wasn't just about finding Harold, but about finding herself. The woman who had fallen in love with Harold 45 years ago, who had believed that love was about acceptance and partnership rather than improvement and control. That woman was still somewhere inside her, buried under decades of disappointment and fear, but still there. The lake house looked smaller than Dorothy remembered, but it was exactly where it had always been, nestled among pine trees on a small cove that reflected the late afternoon sky like a mirror. The building showed its age, with paint peeling from the shutters and a front porch that sagged slightly on one side, but it was still the same magical place where she and Harold had discovered what it meant to be happy together. Dorothy parked her car on the gravel driveway and sat for a moment, overwhelmed by memories that felt both ancient and immediate. Harold's car was nowhere to be seen, but Dorothy hadn't really expected it to be. If he was staying here, he would probably be walking or sitting by the water, doing the quiet things that had always brought him peace. She gathered her courage and approached the front door. not sure if the current owners would welcome an unexpected visitor, or if they would even know anything about Harold's possible presence. An elderly woman answered Dorothy's knock, someone about her own age with paint-stained fingers and a welcoming smile. She introduced herself as Patricia Winters, and Dorothy's heart nearly stopped when she heard the familiar last name. Patricia explained that she was Harold's cousin, the daughter of the uncle who had owned the cabin during Dorothy and Harold's early visits. Patricia had inherited the place 5 years ago and had been slowly renovating it while using it as a retreat for family members who needed a quiet place to think or heal. Patricia invited Dorothy inside for tea, and as they sat in the small kitchen that still smelled of pine wood and lake air, Dorothy learned that Harold had indeed been there. He had arrived 2 weeks ago, looking tired and sad, but determined to find some kind of peace. Patricia had been happy to let him stay as long as he needed, recognizing in Harold's story some echoes of her own difficult marriage that had ended in divorce 20 years earlier. Harold had spent his days walking the shoreline, sitting on the dock with a notebook, and helping Patricia with small repairs around the cabin. He had cooked for her several times, meals that reminded Patricia of the simple, delicious food their grandfather used to prepare during family gatherings when they were children. Harold had talked about his marriage, about his love for Dorothy, and his confusion about how they had grown so far apart. He had wondered aloud whether it was possible for two people to find their way back to each other after so many years of moving in opposite directions. But Harold had left 3 days ago, Patricia told Dorothy. He had been restless during his final few days at the cabin, walking longer distances and spending more time writing in his notebook. On his last morning, he had thanked Patricia for her kindness and mentioned that he had one more place he needed to visit before he could decide what to do with the rest of his life. He hadn't said where he was going, but he had left something behind that Patricia thought Dorothy should see. Patricia led Dorothy to the small bedroom where Harold had been staying, and there on the nightstand was a composition notebook, the kind students use in school. Dorothy's hands trembled as she opened it, expecting to find more letters or painful reflections about their marriage. Instead, she found something that took her breath away. Harold had been writing about forgiveness. Not just forgiving Dorothy for the years of criticism and control, but forgiving himself for staying silent when he should have spoken up, for accepting less than he deserved, for contributing to their problems by refusing to fight for their marriage when fighting might have saved it. Page after page, Harold had worked through his anger and hurt, not by blaming Dorothy, but by trying to understand how two people who had once loved each other so deeply could have become strangers sharing the same house. He wrote about his own failures, his tendency to withdraw instead of engaging, his choice to write letters instead of having difficult conversations. He acknowledged his part in their problems while still being honest about the pain Dorothy's behavior had caused him. The most powerful entry was dated just 5 days ago. Harold had written about a dream where Dorothy came to find him at the lake, not to demand that he come home but to apologize for the ways she had hurt him. In the dream, they had sat on the dock together, talking honestly for the first time in years, both of them taking responsibility for their failures and expressing hope that they could learn to love each other better. Harold had written that he knew this dream was probably just wishful thinking, but that he had decided to give Dorothy one more chance to surprise him. At the bottom of that entry, Harold had written an address. Dorothy recognized it immediately, even though she hadn't thought about the place in more than 20 years. It was the address of St. Mary's Retreat Center, a Catholic monastery about an hour north of the lake where Harold had once attended a men's retreat during a particularly difficult period in their marriage. Dorothy remembered being annoyed that he was spending a weekend away from home when there were chores that needed to be done. But Harold had returned from that retreat with a sense of peace that had lasted for months afterward. Patricia offered to let Dorothy stay at the cabin for as long as she needed, but Dorothy knew she couldn't rest until she found Harold. She thanked Patricia for her kindness and for sharing Harold's notebook, which Patricia insisted Dorothy should keep. As Dorothy prepared to leave for the monastery, Patricia gave her one piece of advice that struck her like lightning. She said that in her experience, the hardest part of healing a broken relationship wasn't learning how to love someone again, but learning how to let them love you back. Dorothy would need to be prepared not just to apologize to Harold, but to accept his forgiveness and believe that she was worth loving despite her failures. The drive to St. Mary's took Dorothy through mountains that seemed to touch the sky, past meadows filled with wildflowers and streams that sparkled in the early evening light. She found herself praying for the first time in years. Not the formal prayers of her childhood, but desperate, honest conversations with whatever force in the universe might be listening. She prayed for the courage to be completely honest with Harold. She prayed for the wisdom to know how to love him better. Most of all, she prayed for the chance to try again, to show Harold that the woman he had fallen in love with decades ago was still somewhere inside the critical, controlling person she had become. The monastery appeared around a bend in the mountain road like something from a fairy tale, its stone buildings and bell tower rising from a valley filled with gardens and walking paths. Dorothy parked in the small lot near the main building and sat for a moment, trying to gather her courage. She had no idea if Harold was actually here, or if the monks would even tell her if he was. She knew that retreats were supposed to be private, sacred times when people could find peace away from the complications of their regular lives. Would she be intruding on something Harold needed? Would her presence here just create more problems instead of solving them? But Dorothy had come too far to turn back now. She approached the main building, where a simple wooden sign directed visitors to ring a bell and wait for assistance. The monk who answered the door was younger than Dorothy had expected, with a kind face and gentle manner that immediately put her at ease. She explained that she was looking for her husband, that they had been separated, and she was hoping to reconcile with him. She gave Harold's name and description, trying to convey the urgency of her mission without seeming like someone who might disrupt the peaceful atmosphere of the retreat. Brother Michael, as the monk introduced himself, listened to Dorothy's story with the patience of someone accustomed to hearing about human pain and complicated relationships. He explained that the monastery did have a guest currently staying with them who matched Harold's description, but that retreat guests were given complete privacy, unless they specifically requested otherwise. However, Brother Michael offered to deliver a message if Dorothy would like to write a letter, with no guarantee about whether or when Harold might choose to respond. Dorothy spent an hour in the monastery's small chapel, writing what might have been the most important letter of her life. She didn't try to explain everything that had gone wrong between them, or make excuses for her behavior, or promise changes she wasn't sure she could make. Instead, she simply told Harold that she was sorry. Sorry for the years of criticism and control. Sorry for forgetting how to appreciate the good man he had always been. Sorry for choosing being right over being happy, perfection over peace. She told him that she had found his letters, that she had begun to understand how much pain she had caused him, and that she wanted to learn how to love him the way he deserved to be loved. At the end of the letter, Dorothy wrote something that surprised even her. She told Harold that if he had found peace without her, if he was happier alone than he had been in their marriage, she would try to accept that. She said that his happiness mattered more to her than her own fear of being alone, and that she was finally ready to put his needs ahead of her own desire to control their relationship. She signed the letter simply, "With love and hope, Dorothy," and gave it to Brother Michael with a prayer that Harold would at least read it, even if he chose not to respond. Brother Michael told Dorothy that there was a small inn about 5 miles down the mountain road where she could stay while she waited to see if Harold wanted to meet with her. The inn, called Mountain View Lodge, was a family-run establishment where guests were welcomed like old friends, and the pace of life moved slowly enough for healing and reflection. Dorothy checked into a small room with a view of the valley below, and settled in to wait, not knowing if Harold would contact her in hours, days, or ever. That night, as Dorothy sat on the small balcony outside her room, watching stars appear in the darkening sky, she thought about all the ways her life had changed since Harold's disappearance just 2 months ago. She had learned things about her husband that she should have known years ago. She had faced uncomfortable truths about herself that she had been avoiding for decades. She had discovered that change was possible even for someone her age, even for someone as set in her ways as she had believed herself to be. But the most important thing Dorothy had learned was that love wasn't about perfection or control, or even happiness in every moment. Love was about choosing to see the best in someone, even when they showed you their worst. Love was about forgiveness and second chances, and the courage to be vulnerable, even when vulnerability felt dangerous. Love was about accepting that you couldn't change another person, only yourself, and that sometimes the most loving thing you could do was step back and let someone you cared about find their own path to peace. Dorothy fell asleep that night with Harold's notebook on the table beside her bed, and for the first time in months, she slept without the weight of anger or resentment pressing down on her chest. She dreamed about the early days of their marriage, when Harold's laugh could make her forget any worry, and her smile could light up Harold's entire day. In her dream, they were young again, but they carried with them all the wisdom that pain and time had taught them about what really mattered in life. It was the kind of dream that felt more like hope than memory, and Dorothy woke with the strange certainty that whatever happened next, she was finally ready to face it with an open heart. Dorothy woke the next morning to a gentle knock on her door. The innkeeper, a woman named Sarah with flour-dusted hands and a warm smile, had brought her coffee and freshly baked blueberry muffins, along with a message that had arrived early that morning. Dorothy's heart raced as Sarah handed her an envelope with her name written in Harold's familiar handwriting. Her hands shook as she opened it, afraid of what she might find inside. The letter was brief, but every word felt carefully chosen. Harold wrote that he had received her message and that he appreciated her honesty. He said that he needed some time to think about everything she had shared, but that he would like to meet with her the following afternoon in the monastery's meditation garden. He asked that they sit together in silence for a while before they spoke, to give them both time to center themselves for what might be a difficult conversation. He signed the letter, "With cautious hope, Harold," and Dorothy found herself crying at the kindness in those two simple words. The day passed more slowly than any Dorothy could remember. She walked the mountain trails around the inn, trying to burn off the nervous energy that made her feel like she might jump out of her skin. She practiced what she wanted to say to Harold, then decided that practice might make her words sound rehearsed instead of genuine. She changed clothes 3 times, wanting to look like someone Harold might remember loving, but not like someone who was trying too hard to impress him. Finally, she settled on a simple green dress that Harold had once said brought out the color of her eyes, paired with the pearl earrings he had given her for their 25th anniversary. When Dorothy arrived at the monastery the next afternoon, Brother Michael directed her to a small garden tucked behind the main chapel. The space was enclosed by stone walls covered in climbing roses, with a simple wooden bench positioned to overlook a fountain that sent gentle streams of water cascading over smooth river rocks. The sound was soothing, designed to calm minds troubled by the complexities of life outside these peaceful walls. Harold was already there when Dorothy arrived, sitting on the bench with his eyes closed and his face turned toward the afternoon sun. He looked different than he had when he left home 2 months ago. Thinner, but also somehow more solid, as if losing weight had helped him find something essential about himself that had been buried under years of careful compliance. His hair was longer than he usually wore it, and he had grown a short beard that was more gray than brown, but suited his face in a way that made him look distinguished rather than old. Dorothy approached the bench slowly, giving Harold time to acknowledge her presence before she sat down beside him. When he opened his eyes and looked at her, she saw something she hadn't seen in years. Not love exactly, but not anger either. It was the look of someone who was genuinely curious about what might happen next. Someone who had released his expectations enough to be surprised by possibility. They sat in silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, listening to the fountain and the distant sound of church bells marking the time for evening prayers. Dorothy found herself remembering how they used to sit together on their front porch during their early years of marriage, comfortable with quiet moments that didn't need to be filled with conversation. She had forgotten that Harold was someone who could share silence without making it feel empty or uncomfortable. When Harold finally spoke, his voice was gentler than Dorothy had expected. He thanked her for finding him and for the letter she had written. He said that reading her words had been both painful and healing, like having a wound cleaned so it could finally start to mend properly. He told Dorothy that he had spent the past 2 months trying to figure out how to live without her, but that her presence here had made him realize he didn't know if he wanted to live without her, or if he was just afraid to hope for something better. Dorothy listened without interrupting, fighting every instinct that wanted to defend herself, or explain her behavior, or promise that everything would be different. She had spent so many years talking over Harold, correcting him, offering her opinions before he had finished sharing his thoughts. Now, she forced herself to simply receive his words, to let him express himself completely before she responded. Harold talked about the loneliness of their marriage, how he had felt invisible in his own home, unappreciated for the things he did well and constantly criticized for the things he did wrong. He spoke about the erosion of his confidence, how Dorothy's constant corrections had made him second-guess every decision and doubt his ability to do anything right. He described feeling like a guest in his own life, always walking on eggshells and trying to anticipate Dorothy's displeasure so he could avoid triggering another lecture about his inadequacies. But Harold also took responsibility for his own failures. He admitted that he had withdrawn from their marriage instead of fighting for it, that he had chosen silence over difficult conversations that might have cleared the air between them. He acknowledged that his passive resistance had probably frustrated Dorothy as much as her criticism had hurt him, creating a cycle where both of them felt misunderstood and unappreciated. When Harold finished speaking, Dorothy felt as if she had been holding her breath for 40 years and could finally exhale. Everything he had said was true, and hearing it spoken aloud without anger or blame somehow made it easier to bear than she had expected. She thanked Harold for his honesty and for giving her the chance to apologize in person. Then she began to share her own journey of discovery over the past 2 months. Dorothy told Harold about finding his letters and how reading them had forced her to see herself through his eyes for the first time. She spoke about her conversations with people who knew Harold outside their marriage, and how she had learned about the man he was when he wasn't being constantly corrected and criticized. She described her growing understanding of how her need for control had suffocated their relationship, and how her fear of vulnerability had made her choose criticism over compassion whenever she felt scared or uncertain. But the most important thing Dorothy shared with Harold was her realization that she couldn't promise to change overnight, or guarantee that old patterns wouldn't sometimes resurface. What she could promise was that she finally understood what she had lost, and that she was committed to doing the hard work of becoming someone worthy of his love again. She told Harold that she had started seeing a counselor, someone who was helping her understand the roots of her controlling behavior and teaching her healthier ways to handle fear and disappointment. Harold listened to Dorothy's words with the same careful attention she had given to his, and when she finished speaking, he reached over and took her hand. It was the first time they had touched in months, and Dorothy was surprised by how natural it felt, how her hand remembered the exact shape and warmth of Harold's fingers. Harold told Dorothy that he could see the changes in her, not just in her words, but in the way she carried herself, the way she listened, the way she had approached their conversation with openness instead of defensiveness. He said that the woman sitting beside him reminded him of the woman he had fallen in love with all those years ago, but with the added depth that comes from surviving pain and choosing growth over bitterness. But Harold also told Dorothy something that broke her heart, even as it gave her hope. He said that he couldn't simply come home and pretend that nothing had happened. The trust between them had been damaged, and trust was something that had to be rebuilt slowly, through consistent actions rather than good intentions. He suggested that they spend some time dating each other again, relearning how to be together without the weight of decades of hurt and disappointment overshadowing every interaction. Dorothy's immediate impulse was to argue, to point out that they were married and shouldn't need to date, that they could work on their problems while living in the same house. But she caught herself before the words left her mouth, recognizing that this was exactly the kind of controlling response that had driven Harold away in the first place. Instead, she asked Harold what he thought their dating process might look like, genuinely curious about his ideas, rather than automatically resistant to anything that wasn't her own plan. Harold suggested that they start by spending 1 day a week together, doing things they used to enjoy during their courtship and early marriage. They could take walks, share meals, visit places that held good memories for them. They could practice talking to each other without criticism or defensiveness, learning to be curious about each other's thoughts and feelings instead of trying to change or control them. If those weekly visits went well, they could gradually increase their time together until they felt ready to consider sharing the same home again. The proposal terrified Dorothy because it meant accepting that Harold might decide she wasn't worth the effort of rebuilding their relationship. But it also excited her because it offered the possibility of falling in love with Harold all over again, of discovering who they could be together without the baggage of all their past mistakes weighing them down. Dorothy agreed to Harold's plan, and they spent the next hour walking through the monastery grounds, making tentative plans for their first official date the following week. They would meet at the small diner where Dorothy had stopped during her drive to find Harold, the place where the waitress named Mary Ellen had taught Dorothy about the importance of choosing love over being right. They would share a meal and then take a walk around the town, practicing the art of enjoying each other's company, without any agenda beyond simple togetherness. As Dorothy prepared to leave the monastery that afternoon, Harold walked her to her car and gave her something that made her heart skip. It was a small purple flower he had picked from the monastery's garden, the kind of tiny wildflower that most people would overlook, but that Harold had always noticed because of his attention to small, beautiful details. He told Dorothy that he had been picking flowers for her in his mind for months, wanting to share little moments of beauty with her but not knowing if she would appreciate such simple gestures. Dorothy held that flower all the way back to the inn, and that night she pressed it between the pages of Harold's notebook, where his words about forgiveness could protect this first small sign that their love might still be worth saving. She called the number Harold had given her for the small apartment he was renting in a town near the monastery, and they talked on the phone for an hour about everything except their marriage. They discussed books they had been reading, changes in their old neighborhood, memories of trips they had taken in the past. It was the kind of easy conversation they hadn't shared in years, and Dorothy went to sleep that night, feeling hopeful for the first time since Harold had disappeared. But hope, Dorothy soon discovered, was more complicated than she had expected. Their first official date went well enough. They shared a pleasant meal at Mary Ellen's diner, took a short walk around the town's small downtown area, and managed to have a conversation that lasted 2 hours without a single criticism or defensive response from either of them. But Dorothy found herself exhausted by the effort of monitoring every word, of catching herself before she offered unsolicited advice or corrected some small detail in Harold's stories. More challenging was the loneliness of returning to their empty house after each date, knowing that Harold was going back to his small apartment instead of coming home with her. The silence that had once felt oppressive now felt completely hollow, as if all the life had been drained out of the rooms where they had built their marriage. Dorothy found herself talking to Harold's absence, sharing thoughts and observations with empty chairs, setting 2 places at the dinner table out of habit, and then having to clear away the extra plate when she remembered she was eating alone. The worst moments came late at night, when Dorothy would lie in their bed and remember all the years she had taken Harold's presence for granted. She thought about all the times she had moved to her side of the bed to avoid accidental contact with Harold's warm body, all the nights she had fallen asleep without saying goodnight or expressing any affection. She remembered the morning routine they had shared for decades, how Harold would bring her coffee in bed every Saturday and Sunday, how she had usually responded to this kindness by mentioning something she wanted him to fix around the house, instead of simply saying thank you. 3 weeks into their dating experiment, Dorothy experienced what felt like a complete emotional breakdown. She had spent the day cleaning their house from top to bottom, as if making everything perfect might somehow convince Harold to come home sooner. But as she was vacuuming the guest bedroom, she found one of Harold's old sweaters tucked away in the closet, something he had probably forgotten when he packed his bags. She held that sweater to her face, breathing in the faint scent of his aftershave and the peculiar combination of wool and kindness that had always surrounded Harold like a gentle cloud. Dorothy sat on the guest bed and cried harder than she had cried since childhood, not just for Harold, but for all the years she had wasted being angry instead of grateful, critical instead of appreciative, controlling instead of loving. She cried for the version of herself that had been buried under decades of fear and disappointment, for the young woman who had once known how to accept love without trying to earn it through perfection. She cried for Harold's patience and kindness, qualities she had taken for granted for so long that she had almost forgotten they were gifts rather than obligations. When Dorothy finally stopped crying, she realized something that changed everything about her approach to winning Harold back. She couldn't do this work for Harold, or for their marriage, or even for the sake of not being alone. She had to do this work for herself, to become the kind of person she wanted to be, regardless of whether Harold ever came home. She had to learn how to be happy with her own company, before she could offer that happiness to someone else. Dorothy began to build a life that didn't revolve around Harold's absence or her hope for his return. She joined a book club at the library, something she had always wanted to do but had never made time for because there was always some household task that seemed more important. She volunteered at the community garden, using skills Harold had taught her years ago about growing vegetables and caring for plants. She started taking cooking classes, not because she wanted to impress Harold with fancy meals, but because she had always been curious about cuisines from other cultures. Most importantly, Dorothy continued her work with the counselor Harold had inspired her to find. Dr. Sarah Martinez was a woman about Dorothy's daughter's age if Dorothy had had a daughter. Someone with gentle eyes and the kind of patience that made difficult conversations feel safe instead of threatening. Through their weekly sessions, Dorothy began to understand the deep roots of her need for control, how her childhood in a household where love was conditional on good behavior had taught her that relationships were transactions rather than gifts. Dr. Martinez helped Dorothy see that her criticism of Harold had been a misguided attempt to protect their marriage by making it perfect, as if perfection could somehow guarantee that Harold would never leave her. But perfection, Dorothy learned, was the enemy of love because it required people to hide their authentic selves in order to be acceptable. Real love, the kind that lasted through difficulties and changes, required acceptance of imperfection, both in yourself and in the person you chose to love. As Dorothy's weekly dates with Harold continued, she began to notice changes in both of them. Harold seemed more relaxed, more willing to share his thoughts and feelings without worrying about how she might react. He told stories about his childhood that Dorothy had never heard, shared opinions about books and movies that differed from hers, but that she found interesting rather than threatening. He laughed more easily, and his laughter made Dorothy remember why she had fallen in love with him in the first place. Dorothy found herself changing too, becoming more curious and less judgmental, more interested in understanding Harold's perspective than in proving her own point. She discovered that Harold was actually quite funny when he felt safe enough to let his personality shine, that he had insights about people and situations that she had never bothered to notice when she was too busy trying to correct his behavior. She realized that the man she had been trying to change for decades was actually quite wonderful exactly as he was. But just as Dorothy was beginning to feel confident about their progress, Harold delivered news that shattered her newfound sense of security. During their 8th weekly date, as they were walking along the lakeshore near the cabin where they had reconnected, Harold told Dorothy that he had been offered a job. Not just any job, but a position at a historical society in Oregon, working as a researcher and educational program coordinator. It was exactly the kind of work Harold had always dreamed of doing, combining his love of history with his gift for teaching and helping others learn. The job offer had come through a contact Harold had made during his retreat at the monastery, a fellow history enthusiast who had been impressed by Harold's knowledge and passion for American historical sites. The position would allow Harold to travel throughout the Pacific Northwest, documenting historical locations and developing educational materials for schools and tourist centers. It was the kind of opportunity Harold had never imagined would be available to someone his age, and the organization was eager to have him start as soon as possible. Dorothy's immediate reaction was panic. Oregon was 3,000 miles away. If Harold took this job, their careful process of rebuilding their relationship would become impossible. They couldn't have weekly dates across an entire continent. She would lose him again, just when she was beginning to hope that they might actually have a future together. But as Dorothy looked at Harold's face while he described the job opportunity, she saw something she hadn't seen in years. Harold was excited. Not just pleased or interested, but genuinely excited in a way that made him look 10 years younger. His eyes were bright, his gestures animated, his voice full of enthusiasm for work that would challenge and fulfill him in ways his insurance job never had. This wasn't just a job offer for Harold. It was a chance to become the person he had always wanted to be, to use his talents and interests in ways that mattered. Dorothy realized that this moment was the ultimate test of everything she had learned about love and control over the past few months. She could try to talk Harold out of taking the job, could point out all the reasons why it would be better for their marriage if he stayed close to home. She could make the job offer about her needs and her fears, rather than about Harold's dreams and happiness. Or she could do something that would have been impossible for the woman she used to be. She could support Harold's dream, even if it meant sacrificing her own hopes for their reconciliation. The choice Dorothy made in that moment changed everything between them, not because it guaranteed a happy ending, but because it proved that she had finally learned the difference between love and control. Dorothy told Harold that the job sounded perfect for him, that she had never seen him so excited about anything in all their years together. She said that if this opportunity made him happy, then she wanted him to take it, regardless of what it meant for their relationship. Harold stared at Dorothy as if he was seeing her for the first time, and Dorothy realized that this might be the first time in their marriage that she had put Harold's happiness ahead of her own security. It was terrifying and liberating at the same time, like stepping off a cliff and discovering that she had wings she never knew existed. Harold stood completely still for what felt like forever, staring at Dorothy as if he was trying to memorize her face, or perhaps figure out if he had imagined her words. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion, and something that might have been wonder. He told Dorothy that in all their years of marriage, she had never once encouraged him to pursue something that might take him away from her, even temporarily. He said that her response to his job offer was the most loving thing she had ever said to him, not because the words themselves were particularly romantic, but because they proved that she finally understood what love actually meant. But Harold also told Dorothy something that surprised them both. He said that her willingness to let him go to Oregon made him realize that he didn't want to go anywhere without her. Not because he needed her permission or approval, but because the woman sitting beside him on that lake shore was someone he genuinely wanted to share adventures with. The Dorothy who could put his happiness ahead of her own fear was someone he wanted to travel with, explore with, build a new kind of life with. Harold asked Dorothy if she would consider coming to Oregon with him, not as someone following her husband, but as someone choosing her own adventure. He pointed out that she had never lived anywhere except their small Connecticut town, had never had the chance to discover who she might be in a place where nobody knew her history or had expectations about who she should be. Oregon could be a fresh start for both of them, a place where they could build a marriage based on who they were now, rather than who they had been during their worst years together. The idea terrified Dorothy, but it also excited her in ways she hadn't felt since she was young. She had always been curious about other parts of the country, but had never had the courage to suggest traveling or relocating, because change felt too risky, too far outside her need for control and predictability. Now, the thought of starting over somewhere new felt like freedom rather than fear. She could be the woman she was becoming, rather than the woman everyone expected her to be. But Dorothy needed time to think about such a major decision. She asked Harold if they could table the Oregon discussion for a few days while she considered what it would mean to leave everything familiar behind. Harold agreed, understanding that the woman Dorothy had become would want to make such an important choice thoughtfully, rather than impulsively. That night, Dorothy called Dr. Martinez for an emergency phone session, needing to talk through the emotions that Harold's invitation had stirred up. Dr. Martinez helped Dorothy see that her fear of moving to Oregon wasn't really about geography or logistics. It was about the deeper fear of stepping fully into her new identity, of leaving behind the last vestiges of the controlling, critical woman she used to be. As long as Dorothy stayed in Connecticut, surrounded by people and places that remembered her old patterns, it would be easy to slide back into familiar behaviors when stress or uncertainty arose. Moving to Oregon would be like cutting the final cord that connected Dorothy to her worst self. It would require her to trust that the changes she had made were real and permanent, that she could build relationships based on kindness rather than control, that she could handle uncertainty without trying to manage every detail of her environment. It would be the ultimate act of faith in her own growth, and in Harold's love for the woman she was becoming. 3 days later, Dorothy gave Harold her answer while they were having coffee at Mary Ellen's diner, the place that had become their safe space for important conversations. She told Harold that she wanted to go to Oregon with him, not because she was afraid to be without him, but because she was excited to discover what kind of life they could build together when they both felt free to be their authentic selves. She said that she wanted to see Harold doing work that fulfilled him, and she wanted to find out what kinds of dreams she might pursue in a place where she felt brave enough to take risks. Harold's smile when Dorothy accepted his invitation was like watching the sun come out after a long winter. He reached across the table and took both of her hands in his, and for the first time in decades, Dorothy felt the full warmth of being truly seen and appreciated by the man she loved. They began making plans immediately, with an enthusiasm that reminded Dorothy of their early days together, when everything seemed possible and the future was full of adventures waiting to be discovered. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of preparations for their cross-country move. They sold their house to a young couple who fell in love with Dorothy's rose garden and promised to take good care of the home where Dorothy and Harold had learned so many difficult but important lessons about love and forgiveness. Dorothy donated most of their furniture to charity, keeping only the pieces that held special memories and would help them create a new beginning in their Oregon home. As Dorothy packed their belongings, she found herself rediscovering treasures she had forgotten they owned. Wedding photos where both of them looked impossibly young and completely confident that love would be enough to overcome any obstacle. Love letters Harold had written during a business trip early in their marriage, filled with romantic observations about missing her laugh and counting the days until he could hold her again. A pressed flower from their honeymoon at Lake Champlain, carefully preserved between the pages of a cookbook Dorothy hadn't opened in years. Each rediscovered memory reminded Dorothy of who they had been before life's disappointments had hardened their hearts against each other. But instead of feeling sad about the years they had lost to misunderstanding and hurt, Dorothy found herself feeling grateful for the journey that had brought them to this point. They couldn't have appreciated this second chance when they were young and took love for granted. It was only because they had survived the worst of times that they could fully cherish the gift of finding their way back to each other. The goodbye dinner their neighbors threw for Dorothy and Harold was an event that would have been unimaginable 6 months earlier. People who had barely spoken to Dorothy for years came to wish them well, sharing stories about Harold's kindness and expressing genuine happiness about Dorothy's transformation. Mrs. Peterson from next door told Dorothy that she had never seen her look so peaceful and content, and that whatever changes Dorothy had made in her life clearly agreed with her. Mary Ellen from the diner drove an hour from her small town to attend the farewell dinner, bringing a gift that made Dorothy cry with gratitude. It was a small wooden sign with a quote about marriage that read, "The best love is the kind that awakens the soul and makes us reach for more, that plants a fire in our hearts and brings peace to our minds." Mary Ellen said she had seen that quote in a shop window and immediately thought of Dorothy and Harold, who proved that it was never too late to discover what real love could look like. The drive to Oregon took Dorothy and Harold 5 days, traveling slowly through states Dorothy had never seen, and stopping at historical sites that made Harold's eyes light up with the joy of sharing his passion with someone who genuinely wanted to learn. They stayed in small bed and breakfasts along the way, holding hands while walking through towns where nobody knew their history, where they could simply be a couple in love enjoying a cross-country adventure together. Dorothy found herself falling in love with Harold all over again during that drive, but this time it was a deeper, more intentional love than the giddy infatuation of their youth. This love was built on acceptance rather than expectation, on appreciation rather than the need to improve or fix. She loved Harold's patience when she asked questions about the historical sites they visited. She loved his excitement when he discovered a museum or monument he hadn't known existed. She loved the careful way he helped her in and out of the car, not because he thought she was fragile, but because kindness had become his natural way of moving through the world. Their new home in Oregon was a small cottage near the coast, with windows that overlooked rolling hills covered in evergreen trees, and a garden where Dorothy could grow vegetables and flowers in soil that was completely different from anything she had worked with before. Harold's new job required him to travel throughout the region 3 days a week, which gave Dorothy time to explore her own interests and build her own life, rather than defining herself entirely through her relationship with Harold. Dorothy enrolled in pottery classes at the local community college, something she had always wanted to try but had never made time for during their busy years in Connecticut. She discovered that working with clay required the same kind of patience and gentle persistence that she was learning to bring to her marriage, and that creating something beautiful with her hands gave her a sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with managing or controlling anyone else's behavior. She also began volunteering at a literacy program for immigrant families, using skills she didn't even know she possessed to help women learn English and navigate their new communities. The work was challenging and rewarding in ways Dorothy had never experienced, and it helped her understand that she had valuable gifts to offer the world beyond maintaining a perfect household or improving her husband's behavior. But the most important change in Dorothy's life was the way she and Harold began each day together. Instead of rushing through morning routines focused on tasks and obligations, they made time to sit on their small back porch, with coffee and pastries, watching the sunrise and sharing their plans and dreams for the day ahead. These morning conversations became the foundation of their new marriage, a daily practice of choosing connection over efficiency, presence over productivity. 6 months after their move to Oregon, Harold surprised Dorothy with a trip back to Lake Champlain for their 44th wedding anniversary. They stayed at the same cabin where Dorothy had found Harold's notebook about forgiveness. But this time they were there together, as partners rather than strangers trying to find their way back to each other. On their anniversary morning, Harold and Dorothy walked to the small dock where they had once fished together during their honeymoon, and Harold pulled a small wrapped package from his jacket pocket. Inside was a simple silver bracelet engraved with the date of their wedding and the words, "Second Chances." Harold told Dorothy that he had ordered the bracelet months ago, back when he wasn't sure if their marriage could be saved, but that he had wanted to have something to mark their journey back to each other, if they were brave enough to make that journey together. As Harold fastened the bracelet around Dorothy's wrist, she realized that this moment felt more meaningful than their original wedding day. When they were young, their promises to love each other had been made in innocence, without any real understanding of how difficult those promises would be to keep. This anniversary was different because they were renewing their commitment with full knowledge of each other's flaws and failures, choosing love with their eyes wide open to both the beauty and the challenges of sharing a life with another imperfect human being. Dorothy and Harold spent their anniversary afternoon sitting on the dock, talking about their dreams for the future, with the same excitement they had once brought to planning their first home together. Harold shared his ideas for a book he wanted to write about lesser-known historical sites in the Pacific Northwest. Dorothy talked about her plans to start a support group for wives who were learning to change controlling behaviors in their marriages, wanting to help other women avoid the years of loneliness and regret she had experienced. But they also talked about simpler dreams that felt just as important as their professional goals. Harold wanted to learn how to make bread from scratch, something his grandmother had taught him as a child, but that he had never had time to practice during his working years. Dorothy wanted to plant a flower garden that would attract butterflies and hummingbirds, creating a sanctuary where she could practice the patience and gentle observation that had become central to her new way of being in the world. As the sun set over Lake Champlain on their anniversary evening, Dorothy found herself thinking about all the different versions of herself she had been during her 72 years of life. The eager young bride who had believed love would always be easy. The frustrated middle-aged woman who had tried to control everyone around her because she couldn't control her own fears and disappointments. The broken-hearted wife who had driven away the man she loved most. And finally, the woman she was now, someone who had learned that real love required the courage to be vulnerable, the wisdom to accept what couldn't be changed, and the grace to forgive both herself and others for being beautifully, imperfectly human. The last chapter of Dorothy and Harold's love story was still being written, but Dorothy knew now that it would be different from their beginning chapters, deeper and more intentional, because it was built on truth rather than fantasy. They had learned that love wasn't just a feeling, but a choice. Not just a promise, but a daily practice. Not just about being happy, but about being real with each other even when reality was uncomfortable or difficult. On their final morning at the lake, Dorothy and Harold made one more decision that would have been impossible for the people they used to be. They decided to start a tradition of returning to Lake Champlain every year on their anniversary, not to relive the past, but to celebrate their ongoing commitment to growing and changing together. They would use their annual trips to assess how they were doing as partners, to share their dreams for the coming year, and to remember that love was not a destination, but a journey that required attention and intention every single day. As they packed their belongings and prepared to return to their new life in Oregon, Dorothy felt a sense of completeness she had never experienced before, not because her life was perfect or because all of her problems had been solved, but because she had finally learned how to love and be loved without trying to control the outcome. She had discovered that the secret to a happy marriage wasn't finding the perfect person, but learning how to love an imperfect person perfectly, with all the patience and kindness and forgiveness that such love required. Harold loaded their suitcases into the car and came around to open Dorothy's door, a small courtesy he had always performed, but that Dorothy was finally able to receive as the gift of love it had always been. As they drove away from Lake Champlain toward their future together, Dorothy reached over and took Harold's hand, grateful beyond words for the journey that had brought them from the brink of losing each other to this moment of quiet, certain love. The road ahead stretched out before them, full of unknown adventures and challenges and joys, but Dorothy was no longer afraid of uncertainty. She had learned that love was not about controlling what happened next, but about trusting that whatever came, they would face it together with open hearts and the hard-won wisdom that comes from choosing to love deeply, honestly, and without reservation. Their story was far from over, but Dorothy knew that the chapters yet to be written would be their finest yet, because they had finally learned that the secret to a beautiful love story was not perfection, but the courage to keep loving even when love required everything you had to give.